Hello, welcome to EVN Report and Examining the Context podcast. As always, my guest is Dr. Nerses Kopalyan, the author of EVN Security Report. Welcome to the program, Nerses.
Always nice to be here.
We're going to be talking about the January security briefing, which you entitled Why Aliyev Thinks He Has to Attack Armenia Soon. It's been a very widely read report, notwithstanding the realities behind it, obviously. Armenia's Foreign Intelligence Service recently released its first annual report. In that report, it says that it does not anticipate full-scale war with Azerbaijan. It does warn, however, of the high probability of targeted surgical strikes against Armenia. And you've written, for Aliyev, launching an interstate militarized conflict is not only a preference, but a priority. And you've written about conflict persistence multiple times in the past. Can you explain, first of all, the report by the FIS mentioned this, and you're also concurring, saying that there is a high probability for this?
Well, the FIS report did a very solid job of producing and displaying the general risk that Armenia faces within a domain of risk, propensity, and conflict. And when we look at all probability modeling on this, we know that tensions remain high and the probability of some interstate militarized actions by Azerbaijan tend to be very high. But that is not the same as large-scale war. And within a domain of risk propensity, we understand that a large-scale war would be too risky for Aliyev, not by virtue of the fact that Armenia is somehow a threat to him, but by virtue of the fact that the fog of war, the international dynamics, Armenia's enhanced security capabilities, all of those go into his calculations. So if you're Aliyev, it makes rational sense for you to engage in surgical strikes to basically undertake localized operations and achieve some of your objectives through that approach, as opposed to initiating a large-scale war, which is basically a lot more resource intense and high risk. This is the framework and the domain of analytical thinking that we use to make that assessment. So the FIS's approach remains quite consistent through that domain. But when we look at Aliyev's or Baku's behavior and trying to understand what shapes that behavior, an important thing to realize is that they operate off of a playbook that they developed from 2007. This has been part of in some of my writings. This has been part of a lot of discussions we have. And this is where Aliyev and the security apparatus did three things. One, they began Turkifying, quote unquote, their armed forces, their military training, their capabilities. Two, they developed a very grand strategy through which they are going to utilize warfare as a method of reclaiming from their lands and absorbing and occupying Nagorno-Karabakh. So declaring war, utilizing warfare, and achieving their objectives through use of force has been part of their national security policy since 2007. It was enhanced a few years after that, which included more purchases of weaponry, immense purchases of weaponry, and that led to 2016, and then, of course, the 2020 war. Why am I kind of giving you this long-winded answer? Baku's demeanor in the region is based on of its grand strategy. And that grand strategy follows the following logic that for Azerbaijan to be able to exercise control in the region and for Azerbaijan to be able to engage with Armenia, they must have a power disparity with Armenia. So power asymmetry or an imbalance in power remains fundamental to their grand strategy. So the fact that Aliyev spent billions from 2010 all the way to 2020 is not accidental. It wasn't simply about Nagorno-Karabakh. Nagorno-Karabakh was the first step. But after winning that war and then doing this ethnic cleansing and absorbing it, it doesn't stop there because their grand strategy entails the preservation of the power disparity and the imbalance of power. So when observed through that confluence of those developments, we see then that if their national interest dictates and stipulates that the preservation of power asymmetry is their number one priority, then Baku, then Aliyev has to engage in behavior that is commensurate with that grand strategy. And that says that Armenia cannot close the power asymmetry. It doesn't mean that Armenia is going to quickly close it. It doesn't mean that that gap in power disparity is going to be closed in a matter of a year or two. But what it says is that even the attempt and some closing of that power asymmetry contradicts Azerbaijan's strategic interests. So, regardless of any conversation that we're having about the peace treaty, Aliyev's posturing, this issue or that issue, those are a different phenomenon. Fundamentally, Aliyev wants to engage in all those conversations or engage in all these regional engagements, from transport links to possible opening of this or that, through the contours of him having immense power asymmetry. So when he sees that Armenia is now vigorously rearming itself, engaging in billions of dollars of arms procurement, he remains terrified because it is rupturing this grand strategy that they had developed. It is through that lens that we have to approach the concept of risk propensity. For Aliyev, the fact that Armenia is developing the capability to, at one point or in some time, to close that power gap to whatever degree doesn't matter for him, that Armenia is developing the capacity to somehow close some of that power gap, to him, that is a severe risk to the large grand strategy and the billions he has spent doing. Therefore, it becomes very rational for him to utilize force and to engage in behavior that is going to stop Armenia from closing that power asymmetry.
Well, it's multifaceted because he has to deal with his own domestic audience, with his own grip on power, and I'll come to that in a minute. But it's also important to understand that what Armenia is procuring is to enhance its deterrence capabilities. It's defensive weaponry, not offensive weaponry. And as you write in the security briefing, Armenia is vigorously continuing with the diplomatization of its security. It has signed, the strategic partnership with the United States. It's procuring arms from India, France, and other countries. Its dependency on Russia is now almost, it's
Non-existent. In the realm of security, it's non-existent, correct.
right. And in his recent interviews, one in December and one in January, his rhetoric has ramped up. Is this only because of his fear of losing this power asymmetry, or is it also speaking to his own regime, if you will?
At this point, there are no threats to his regime. Aliyev rules like a god in Azerbaijan. There are no structures that could challenge him. There are no factions that could challenge him. And there is no civil society that can have a bottom-up movement to somehow disrupt the complete totalitarian system that is created. So I don't think domestic audience is part of this configuration. To kind of touch up the initial point that you made, Aliyev is not so much concerned with Armenia's soft deterrence capabilities, which is the diplomatization of security, closer relations with the West, resiliency modeling with the European Union, et cetera, et cetera. Sure, he may bark about it, and his FMFA may come out and claim, bias by the West against Azerbaijan, but his rhetoric was not as aggressive. But when he saw that Armenia is procuring the weapons that it is from India, and now that it's getting the advanced weapon systems from France and has access to international markets, this is, from Aliyev's lens, where the danger comes from. And this is why when he starts speaking to any international observer, it seems unreasonable. How could one country tell another country that you do not have the right to develop basic defensive capabilities? How could one country tell another country that you cannot buy weapons? To any neutral observer, that is nonsensical. But what Aliyev is saying from his lens is that Armenia cannot close the power asymmetry. What he's saying is that because I'm seeing Armenia developing the capabilities that are going to allow them to have some deterrence, that is harming my grand strategy, a number one national security interest. Now, why does Armenia's ability for minimal deterrence, right, and this is purely a defensive posture, terrifying Aliyev? Because once Armenia has deterrence, Aliyev cannot dictate terms. Once Armenia has deterrence, Aliyev cannot invade at will without severe losses. And so he's not concerned about Armenia developing offensive capabilities and attacking him. That's nonsensical. He knows it. But he's very concerned that if he cannot use force as a mechanism of imposing his will on Armenia, his entire grand security architecture collapses. And this is precisely what deterrence does. Deterrence basically denies an aggressive actor from imposing their will. So Aliyev's concern isn't Armenia attacking and reoccupying territories from their lands. His concern is that if Armenia has minimal deterrence where Baku cannot attack at will or whenever Aliyev wants to impose his will, that disrupts his capacity to use his power disparity to his advantage. In that context, that remains his biggest concern. And he's seeing that Armenia's ability to purchase more than $3 billion in weaponry in the last 3 years, which is more than what Armenia has purchased in the last 15 years, is a severe, severe concern for him. And so what Aliyev right now is doing is what Armenia basically failed to do after 1994. Right? After 1994, when Armenia observed that Azerbaijan was immensely engaging in an arms race and accruing capabilities, Armenia had no mechanism or no solution to that. They just basically went along. Aliyev is not doing that. Aliyev is very cognizant of that, and this comes out quite directly from his own interviews, as you noted, right? He specifically noted that Armenia is quote unquote forcing Azerbaijan to engage in an arms race. That is his way of saying that he must maintain the imbalance of power, that he cannot allow a balance of power to create. And when we look at the literature on basically distribution of power in international relations, right, arms race is a concept that became very prominent during the Cold War, right? And this is when one actor tries to maintain parity with another actor. And so both basically continue spending and engaging in an arms race to maintain the balance of power. So what Aliyev is saying is that as Armenia spends to develop minimal deterrence capabilities, he has to spend just as much, if not more, to maintain the disparity. And so in that context, this is a severe concern for him. And the fact that he makes claims such as Armenia must stop arming itself and more so return the weapons that Armenia has purchased, again, these sound, to be honest, stupid to the average observer. But these are not stupid comments from his lens. What he's doing is he's trying to create some form of a self-fulfilling prophecy where he says, I told you that if you keep doing this, I'm going to attack. Now you're forcing me to attack you. So when he attacks, he will say, well, this was a foregone conclusion because I had mentioned it and Armenia kept arming and I have no choice but to attack. This is the rationale that is going to throw out there. Now, of course, no one's going to buy it. Okay, but that's besides the point. The important thing is to understand the rationale that is dictating Azerbaijan's behavior and to understand that any negotiations with them, any conversations with them, any process of delimitations with them, or opening of transit routes, access to Nakhichevan, all these things, those are still important. But when it comes to maintaining the power parity, that takes priority over everything else. And if Aliyev sees that the power disparity is slowly closing, he will use force because he has no other option from his lens. And this is what we're talking about right now.
Okay, in the briefing, you cited academic literature, and you said Aliyev's regime is the most conflict-prone when compared to other forms of authoritarian regimes, such as juntas or elite-constrained regimes. Can you just elaborate a little bit on this, please?
Most definitely. So a lot of research shows that certain types of, so it shows that authoritarian regimes tend to be more conflict-prone than democratic regimes.
And you also wrote that democracies are more prone to be attacked.
Exactly. Now, this doesn't mean that democracies are less prone to conflict. We know that democracies are more prone to conflict. It's just democracies don't go to war with each other. But authoritarian regimes go to war both with other authoritarian regimes and against and with democracies as well. In that context, they are more, relatively speaking, war-prone. In that context, indeed, if an authoritarian regime has a conflict with a democracy or a democratizing state, the probability of the authoritarian actor attacking the democratic state is much, much higher. In that context, Aliyev's or Baku's demeanor remains consistent with the empirical literature on this, that conflict persistency, war proneness is just much higher within his types of regimes. But even within the high war propensity of authoritarian regimes, there are types of authoritarian regimes that are even more prone to engaging in conflict than other types of authoritarian regimes. And these are, as I noted in the report, borrowing from the literature, the civilian authoritarian regime, which makes up what we have in Azerbaijan. Because Aliyev is not a general, this is not a military dictatorship, this is not a junta. We see this is a civilian authoritarian regime. And a lot of the literature shows that indeed civilian-led authoritarian regimes tend to be the most conflict-prone when compared to other forms of authoritarian regimes. So in this context, when we look at the fact that authoritarian regimes, A, are more likely to attack democracies when they have an issue with that democracy, two, that the type of authoritarian regime Azerbaijan has a more tendency to be war-prone, and three, considering the sort of the security architecture of the region and the fact that this authoritarian civilian dictatorship is seeking to maintain power disparity, seeking to maintain power asymmetry, all of the structural factors point to the conclusion that it is in Aliyev's rational interest as a war-prone authoritarian actor to initiate conflict to address the concerns that he has with respect to Armenia trying to create a balance of power and Azerbaijan trying to maintain an imbalance of power.
In all of these podcasts that we do, Nerses, the Russian factor is always factored in. So even though Russia is preoccupied with its war in Ukraine, what is the role of the Russo-Azerbaijani axis in all of this?
So we need to note that the fact that the 2020 war and post-2020 war developments made it very clear that Russia had agreed, whether informally or whatever the case might be, to support Azerbaijan's grand strategy of maintaining a power disbalance in the region. And this is very evident in a few cases. One, during the 2020 war, the amount of weaponry that Russia provided Armenia was abysmal, and the quality is very, very bad. So when you have in of itself a power disparity between Azerbaijan and Armenia going into the 2020 war, and even amidst this war, where Azerbaijan has more advanced systems, and Armenia is relying on its security partner and quote-unquote guarantor to support it during this conflict, but this support ends up being minimal and further reinforced that disparity, it was very clear what was happening in 2020. Even after that, post-2020, we saw that when Azerbaijan made incursions into Rapan, into Syunik area in 2021, the summer of it, right? Russia was nowhere to be seen. More so when Armenia kept asking the Russians that as members of CSTO and as someone who has a bilateral security agreement with Russia, that we have paid you and sent you money for all these weapons, that can you please at least give us what we have purchased from you so we could have minimal deterrence capability, right? So that we could somehow sustain the power asymmetry from becoming even worse. Russia refused to send Armenia a single bullet, right? Anecdotally speaking, during this period. So when you have an actor that sees the imbalance of power becoming worse and refuses to support the declining actor and allowing this disparity to grow, it becomes very evident from the domain of power distribution theory what's going on. And so the power distribution in the region, right, became heavily concentrated in Azerbaijan, and Armenia's continued diminishing. And Russia could have addressed this quite easily because this was prior to the 2020 invasion of Ukraine. So at this point, they had the capabilities of at least maintaining some semblance of balance. They refused to do that, which suggests quite evidently that Azerbaijan and Russia had an understanding that Russia would not play a role in allowing Armenia to at least maintain some semblance of power symmetry. More so, by virtue of the fact that Armenia was part of the CSTO and Russia's security architecture, Armenia did not have access to Western markets. So, not receiving weapons from Russia, Russia refusing to meet its treaty obligations, Russia refusing to even send weapons for the money that Armenia had paid, and Armenia not having access to weapons markets because of being the CSTO, while at the same time, Azerbaijan continuing to purchase weapons within the billions, it became very evident. One actor kept accruing weaponry within the realm of billions of dollars, while the other actor had no access and was denied weaponry by its so-called ally. So the asymmetry kept growing and growing and growing. And so in this context, Aliyev's grand strategy was Armenia has nowhere to go, and the imbalance of power would sustain itself. And Russia's behavior, to answer your question, would reinforce this because Russia would not sell weapons to Armenia. And by virtue of Armenia being in Russia's security architecture, it cannot purchase weapons from anyone else. And the minimal access to Indian weaponry was not going to address the power asymmetry. So Aliyev remained very confident with this model until late 2022 with the Yarmouk invasion. But it was Armenia's Western pivot and policy of diversification that completely threw Aliyev off because Aliyev had never anticipated that Armenia would be able to decouple from Russia, pivot west, and immerse itself into the Western weapons markets, and thus be able to procure weapons in the billions of dollars that it is doing. And this was the calculation that Baku did not anticipate. And hence the borderline hysteria that we are seeing coming out of Aliyev, because he went from anticipating to Armenia not having any weapons or whatever minimal Mickey Mouse stuff that Russia might send down the line, to Armenia purchasing billions in missiles, advanced artilleries from France, advanced drone systems from India, talking to South Korea about tanks, talking to Belgium and purchasing weapons now and then getting contracts with Belgium on certain types, or engaging in these conversations with Poland, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Not to discount the engagement with the United States we're seeing within the security front as well, in developing capabilities, training, and structural shifts. None of this was anticipated by Aliyev when we look at developments from 2020 all the way to 2022. So when all of these things started developing, right, Aliyev's understanding, his regime's calculus of maintaining the power disparity became ruptured. And when they look at these things and they approach these things very rationally, they can see that empirically, Armenia is able to do now what it was not able to do 3-4 years ago, or it wasn't even conceivable that they would be able to do this a few years ago. And this is why we see the aggressive rhetoric coming to Aliyev when he engages in these interviews.
You didn't talk about Turkey in this briefing, but I do want to bring in the Turkish component. Armenia is now in the process of trying to normalize relations with Turkey, but we also know, and you mentioned at the top, Turkey's role in the 2020 war and Turkey's Baku's strategic partner, one nation, two state concept and all of that. And with Turkey's growing role, is this fueling Aliyev? Is this in Turkey's interests? Let me put it this way.
It depends what angle we'll look at. Clearly, I think Turkey is pretty satisfied with developments that have happened post 2020, and they're quite content with the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh and Nagorno-Karabakh in 2023. But I think after that, Turkey does and would like to see more stability in the region because continued conflict persistence creates problems for Turkey as well. Because they have the United States in their ear saying that you have to tell Azerbaijan, your little ally, to behave itself. They have the Europeans in their ear. This is not a distraction that Turkey really wants. This is not the hill that they're going to die on. At the same time, of course, Turkey understands that, Aliyev is an important partner, and Aliyev exercises a lot of influence with Erdogan's political party. They invest a lot of money in Turkey's economy. At the same time, Turkish industry, Turkish construction companies get a lot of contracts and access to the Azerbaijani economy. So there's a mutually reinforcing relationship here, both within the political domain and the economic domain. So Turkey navigates this in a very, very different way. It's multi-tiered and multi-nuanced. So in this context, if Aliyev is dead set on attacking Armenia, this is not the hill that Turkey is going to die on where they put their foot down and say, you're not going to do it. No. But if we're talking about pure Turkish interest, clearly Turkey would prefer a region that has a relatively weak Armenia, a very strong Azerbaijan, and Russia as a diminishing hegemon. But if Azerbaijan's behavior starts creating problems for Turkey with its NATO or Western partners, this is where Turkey doesn't want to deal with an extra headache because they have a lot of things to deal with on their own, from Libya to Syria to the Kurdish issue to Iraq, so on and so forth. So the dynamics for Turkey are quite different. Further, I think Turkey would not mind normalizing relations with Armenia, but Turkey is not going to harm its relationship with Baku on this just to normalize relations with Armenia. And it's just quite clear when we talk to everybody from Brussels to Washington. They tell us that, Turkey would like to normalize relations with Armenia because substantively it has no issues with Armenia. But they understand that Azerbaijan's lobbying and pressure is really, really strong. And so, in that context, you're not going to, ignore the concerns of Azerbaijan to normalize relations with Armenia. And so, we see a lot of this discourse where some make the point that Azerbaijan actually, quote unquote, blackmails Turkey from normalizing relations with Armenia. We have to have an honest conversation about that. And not because Azerbaijan is strong or anything like that. No, because it is a smaller but a strategic partner of Turkey, right? Azerbaijan is very good at engaging what we call asymmetrical aggressive bargaining. And they know how to do this with Ankara. And that's where you stand at this point. Now, is Turkey concerned with Armenia's ability of creating deterrence? I don't think so. This is really nothing that's really relevant for Turkey. Armenia is a very small country with minimal capabilities that is developing. I could honestly say that we have not seen anything out of Turkey on this point. And more so, if this was a concern with Turkey, I think Aliyev has complained to Turkey a lot, and Ankara would have attempted to use this leverage with the European Union, with other Western actors, to stop Armenia from being able to access Western markets. It has not done this. So I don't think this is anywhere on Turkey's priority list or list of concerns with respect to Armenia's ability of developing minimal deterrence capability by purchasing weaponry.
This question that I have, I mean, it might be redundant, but I'm curious. You've written before that Aliyev's international reputation is something that's very important to him. Yet in this security briefing, you wrote that he's willing to lose immense international diplomatic capital if he deems it necessary to preserve the power disparity. We've seen his relationship with the West deteriorating. He's become closer to Russia, their situation in pace. Do you think that this is still something that reputation no longer matters to him? Is it like gloves are off at this point?
I wouldn't say the gloves are off, but you have to understand that Aliyev's reputation was important for him internationally because it served a strategic purpose. It actually allowed him to develop and maintain the power imbalance that he now has. It was because of the relationships that he had with the West, with certain countries. It was because of this reputation that he was able to get sympathy from the West and then be able to use the capabilities that he had against Armenia and get away with it, and therefore establish the power imbalance that he did. So his international reputation was part of his broad, grand strategy of utilizing international diplomatic capital to establish power disparity. But after that disparity was established, the relationships that he has with the West are now having a counterproductive effect on it. And this is why he has no problem rupturing it. Because now the West, which he used as an instrument to establish the imbalance of power in the region, is telling him that you have to tone it down. Or in other words, right, respect Armenia's ability to establish a balance. And to Aliyev, that's not acceptable. And this is why if he sees Armenia's growing ability for deterrence rupturing his capacity to impose his will, he will attack. And if that leads to loss of extensive international diplomatic capital, he's willing to risk it. Because for him, the bottom line is maintaining the power imbalance. His bottom line isn't his international reputation. If his international reputation somehow harms his ability to maintain the imbalance of power, he's going to forego one with the other because his fundamental national interest is maintaining the power disparity.
Just to wrap up, Armenia's government, Armenia's prime minister has been speaking in a language of peace, while Aliyev continues to ramp up the rhetoric, continues to make threats, from the Zangezur corridor to seeing Armenia, parts of Armenia as Western Azerbaijan. Pashinyan, for the domestic audience, for the Armenian audience, is being seen as acquiescing to Aliyev's demand, saying that we will be willing to do this, we will be willing to withdraw our claims at international legal platforms. Is this a strategy on behalf of the Pashinyan government to show the world that it is ready to establish peace, but at any cost?
Well, there's 2 points here. Most definitely, it's a strategy utilized by the government. I don't know what any cost entails in this context. And I think that concept, that term is extensively exaggerated because the Zangezur corridor was a red line. Anything that's specific to Armenia's internationally recognized territories is a red line. So all the other aspects that we're talking about are bases of negotiations. But you have to understand Azerbaijan's strategy here. Azerbaijan is trying to goad Armenia into speaking in the language of conflict, which will give them the precise reasons they need to initiate hostilities. So to accuse the government of not falling into the enemy's trap as some kind of an act of concession is in of itself inconsistent criticism. Okay. And, we all want to engage in chest banging and seek revenge against Azerbaijan. But, international relations and geopolitics cannot be driven by sentiments of, anger or whatever the case might be. And so when you have a power disparity and you engage and fall into the trap that the enemy is trying to set for you so that they could use that power asymmetry against you, that's just stupid policy. So what may come off or seem as concession isn't the same as there being concession. These are conversations that are being had. For example, the prime minister said this 7, 8 months ago, that if a peace treaty is near and that we are going to have peace with our neighboring country, then we are willing to retract the international case that we have against them if peace is signed. Okay, that is a very big qualifier. That is not a unilateral concession of withdrawing all international cases and then not getting a peace treaty. These are intertwined. Okay, but we know very well that Aliyev isn't going to sign a peace treaty anytime soon. Okay, so what the PM is saying this in of itself is not a concession. What he does is part of the second strategy that I noted, where Armenia goes through international community and says, listen, we speak in the language of peace. We speak in the language of compromise. Even on issues that seem extremely difficult for us, we demonstrate space of willing to engage and find a solution. So when you have this narrative that the world is buying, right, when you have this posture that the world is accepting, when someone attacks you after you've developed this posture, you getting international pressure on Azerbaijan is much higher. This is a way of accruing diplomatic capital. But if you go around and you speak in the language of tit for tat, that if Aliyev does this, we will do that. That if Aliyev demands this, we will do that. You're not going to have the same international political capital, considering the fact that you are in such a state of power disparity. And so a lot of people, when they speak on this topic, they tend to ignore the power asymmetry component. It is not as if we have a balance of power or we have sufficient deterrence upon which we could tell Aliyev, you know what, on this point you can screw off, excuse my language, right? Until we have that capability, you cannot speak on that language. I mean, you could, but you're falling into this trap. And so if the accusation is Armenia is doing a very good job of avoiding traps, that's not really an accusation. Okay. As far as concessions that we're talking about, right? Things such as discussing the Minsk Group, for example. Minsk Group has been dead for over a decade. Let's be honest. That's not really a concession. Okay. You could qualify it as a concession. Okay. But if you're going to speak in the language of disbanding the Minsk Group and therefore not giving Aliyev, the tools that he needs to use more aggression towards you, that is a mechanism of basically denying him. Some use the word appeasement. That is a nonsensical term. They don't even use the term correctly when you study international relations, right? A weaker actor cannot engage in appeasement. Appeasement is when you have equal powers and one power refuses conflict, therefore they appease the other equal power. The same way that we saw the UK did with Germany in World War II, with the Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia, and so on and so forth. But when you have a complete asymmetry in capabilities, okay, developing mechanisms of not falling into a stronger actor's trap is not appeasement. Okay, strategic acuity is not appeasement. But I mean, anyways, anybody could utilize whatever language they want. But within the domain of understanding these things, this is how we need to conceptualize it. Furthermore, what peace are we considering, right? When we talk about at any cost, there's no other cost left for Armenia. right? Armenia's point is very clear. We have no capacity, right? Russia betrayed us. There's a power asymmetry. The international community is against us. The issue of Nagorno-Karabakh right now is done. Furthermore, if we tie the issue of Nagorno-Karabakh with the survival of the Republic of Armenia and we go to war with Azerbaijan over it, the sovereignty of Armenia will be at stake. So this conversation right now cannot be had until you have sufficient power capability. So we move beyond that point. What else is there that Armenia can give that would be deemed, right, at all costs to establish peace? There's nothing else. The Zangezur corridor is out of the question. Azerbaijan continually occupying Armenian territories is out of the question, so on and so forth. So in that context, we need to understand that what Armenia is doing at this point is not falling into Azerbaijan's trap, but at the same time, buying time to continue accruing weaponry and enhancing deterrence capability. But I've said this before, we've talked about this before, I've written about this before, until Armenia develops deterrence capability, where Aliyev realizes he cannot impose terms, you're not going to have peace. And as I noted earlier, this is one of the things that's terrifying Aliyev.
You know, I would like to wrap it up here, but I do want to ask a final question. In terms of deterrence capability, Armenia of 2025, is it the same Armenia of 2022 or 2023?
No, it is not. It is not. Armenia militarily is, relatively speaking, much stronger in absolute terms compared to itself. In relative terms to Azerbaijan, it has not strengthened itself to a level of sufficiency where we do have deterrence. But we are much better equipped, relatively speaking, better trained than we were 2 years ago, 3 years ago, or even 1 year ago. Is that enough to deter Azerbaijan at this point? It is not. This is why we're talking about all the things that we're talking about. Okay, but we do have to understand that the weapons that we are receiving and purchasing from the international markets is making Armenia much stronger. The defensive fortification that we are seeing built throughout the country, all these things are making Armenia stronger. Is it enough? Of course not. We can't repeat the same thing over and over again, because if it was, we wouldn't be having these conversations. But at the same time, the fact that Aliyev sees all of this progress happening, he's realizing that his window of opportunity is closing. And so the reason why I talk about surgical strikes in my report is that Aliyev's objective would be to undertake surgical strikes against Armenia's new weapon systems, against Armenia's new defensive positions, to throw Armenia back another 5 years or 10 years, and therefore buy him more time, 5 to 10 years, right, to maintain the imbalance of power. So through Aliyev's lens, right, his preemptive actions are about maintaining the power disparity, because he sees this is not the Armenia of a year ago or 2 years ago. So these are, two different things that we're assessing. But to answer your question, clearly Armenia's military reforms, Armenia's capacity to develop its capabilities has improved. It has to improve. Your budget cannot go from 700 million to 1.6 billion and for it not to improve. Of course it's improving, okay? But whether it's enough or it's not, that's a different subject of conversation. And at this point, it's not. A year from now, it very likely might be with respect to minimum deterrence.
Well, as always, Nerses, thank you for elucidating and continuing the conversation. And as I always say, I hope one day we stop having these conversations, but for the time being, we must continue. So thanks again.
Wonderful to be here.